An aspect of Dungeons & Dragons that I have found fascinating over the years is its use and development of those beings known as devils. Demons too, but as portrayed within the Dungeons & Dragons game, devils are presented with much more of a history and of ties outside of the game itself. What follows is a video essay on the nature of devils. Part 1 of this will explore the devils as per their portrayal in the game. Part 2 will delve more into their connection with, well, not what I would call the real world, but certainly the various mythologies Dungeons & Dragons authors have pulled from in order to populate the 9 hells, in particular the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity and Islam. For Part 1, the primary sources we'll be working with are the 1st edition Monster Manual and Monster Manual 2, the 2nd edition Planes of Lore and Guide to Hell, the 3rd edition Tyrants of the 9 Hells, and the 5th edition Descent into Avernus, and the Dungeon Masters Guild non-canon Chains of Asmodeus. To these works, the Dragon magazine issues 75 and 76 are added, July and August 1983, and Ed Greenwood's excellent article on the 9 Hells therein. Within the Dungeons & Dragons game, a devil is an extraplanar being, native to the outer plane of the 9 Hells, and generally epitomising aspects of the lawful evil alignment. They have a strict tier ranking, with Lemures and Naparibos at the bottom, and the mighty Archdevils at the top. The Archdevils each rule one of the 9 layers of hell, with Asmodeus, the lord of the 9th layer, Nessus, being chief among them. Such is the hierarchy that should a lesser devil receive favour, they may be transformed into a greater type. Souls of the lawful and evil are the currency of hell, and are used by devils to form new devils. Each devil, being evil yet lawful, thus strives to acquire power and influence for itself by working within this rigid structure, often within the schemes of those more powerful than itself. The devils were first introduced into the game within the Monster Manual in 1977, a counter to the chaotic evil demons that had previously been introduced in Eldritch Wizardry in 1976. The idea of planes representing different alignments is, of course, borrowed from Moorcock, who describes various planar dimensions in terms of their balance, or lack thereof, between law and chaos. Gary Gygax extended this basic model out to encompass the 9 alignments and their transitionary forms to fashion the outer planes of Dungeons & Dragons, first published in 1977 within the pages of The Dragon, issue 8. A further refinement on this made its debut in hardback form within 1978's Player's Handbook, and has since received additional attention over the years through all of the various iterations of the game. The lawful evil plane, the 9 Hells, carries echoes of the 9 circles of hell described in Dante's Inferno, these themselves being influenced by thinkers such as Aristotle and Cicero. Gygax's hell is outlined as comprising, in order, Avernus, a rocky wasteland serving as hell's doorstep, and a major site for battles between the devils and their extraplanar foes. Dis, dominated by the infinite maze of an iron city. Manauros, a plain of volcanoes and ever-stinking mud, upon which the capital city is built, and into which it eternally sinks. Phlegethos, a hostile plain of fire and lava, and perhaps the archetypical vision that most have when a place called Hell is invoked. Stygia, a frozen plain of swamps, ice, and oceans. Malbolge, an infinite mountainside down which boulders and terrible avalanches rage. Maladomini, a landscape of industrial corruption, waste and decay. Cana, a mountainous frozen waste of grinding glaciers. And Nessus, a dark, rocky land pierced by crags and rifts of unknown depth. When we are first introduced to the Hells and to Devils, we are introduced to a handful of the Archdevil rulers, Asmodeus of Nessus, Baalzebul of Maladomini, Despater of Dis, and Gorion of Stygia. We are also told that Tiamat, goddess and ruler of all chromatic evil dragons, rules over Avernus. But as we shall see, Avernus is somewhat of a contentious plane in itself. The Monster Manual 2, from 1983, expands on this, introducing us to Belial of Phlegethos, Mammon of Minauros, Moloch of Malbolge, and Mephistopheles of Cana, to round out the 9, as well as listing those major players in the hierarchies of diabolic nobility, some of whom are statistically included in the manual itself. I suspect that the entries here were formed in concert with Ed Greenwood's 9 Hells Dragon articles from issues 75 and 76, as there is much coordination between those articles and the Devil section of the Monster Manual 2. Devils listed within the manual but not otherwise described are described within the pages of Dragon, and so together these sources provide a complete listing of the diabolic nobility as conceived within 1st edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. The natures of the planes in general was, of course, collated into the Manual of the Planes, and the whole panic in the United States over such things led to the temporary departure of these outer planar beings as demons and devils from the 2nd edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. But they returned and were, of course, detailed once more in various Planescape supplements, notably the Planes of Lore set. Some diversionary tactics from the so-called panic were abound, renaming devils Batizu and hell Bator, but whatever. It was hand-waving, as we all know, and whatever you want to call them, or however you want to differentiate between devil and Batizu, if such differentiation can be made, they were, and are, still the same diabolical beings given over to tyranny and schemes of corruption. It is within this setting that we are introduced to the Dark Eight, pit fiends, most of which are named within the Monster Manual 2 lists, and generals of Hell's participation in the Blood War, a massive conflict between the entities of the lower planes of evil. The 9 archfiends have some alteration in this presentation. Bel steps into Avernus as a replacement for Tiamat, or perhaps not a replacement, but that Tiamat was never really Lord of the First Layer at all. Bel, it is said, replaced, or potentially still serves, an unknown, at this time, greater lord, but we'll get more on that later. Despater still rules from his iron city of Dis, and the rulers of Minauros is introduced as Minauros, although later supplements would confirm that the name is simply another conferred to Mammon. So the Lord of Greed still rules from his sinking throne there. Phlegethos' ruler is simply introduced as being female, so not Belial, and having a fiery temper, which we will find more about that later, too. Now we discover that Gorion has been replaced by Levistus. Interesting fellow, Levistus. He was once an archdevil, but made moves on Asmodeus' own queen, Bensosia, and killed her in one version of the story. Asmodeus, in return, imprisoned her within the ice of Styger's oceans. At this point, we might assume, Gorion comes to the fore as Lord of Styger, but after his own attempts to elevate himself, he has been cast out, Levistus being reinstated by Asmodeus for some unfathomable reason. None of this is stated within Planes of Lore. I'm jumping the gun somewhat. Moloch and Baalzebul are not mentioned, just skipped over, as Malbolge and Maladomini having unknown lords, although Malbolge's ruler is identified as she, hinting that it is no longer Moloch. The Lord of Cana is introduced as Baron Molokroth, which, as with Mammon, later turns out to be an alternative name for Mephistopheles. The Lord of Nessus is stated to be a hidden, unknown being. It's not until we get to 1999's Guide to Hell by Chris Pramis that some of these mysteries start to be untangled. In particular, a major event within diabolic history known as the Reckoning. Some of the setup for this, if one chooses to retroactively layer it so, is set in the backgrounds provided for Hell, its layers, and its movers and shakers in the previous, particularly first edition, sources. We know from those sources that the archdevils were in constant spirals of conspiracy against one another, each aiming towards the ultimate goal of ruling hell in Asmodeus' stead. To that end, two main factions become apparent: Mephistopheles along with Despater, Mammon and Gorion, and opposing them Baalzebul along with Moloch, Belial and Zariel. And here we find Zariel mentioned for the first time, so it stands to reason that the unknown figure behind Bel, as hinted at in Planes of Lore, was the fallen angel Zariel, and that Tiamat was simply an immortal inhabitant of Avernus, and not its ruler. Either way, Mephistopheles and Baalzebul reckoned that in order to be able to challenge Asmodeus, they must first eliminate each other. And thus, millennia of machinations between the two factions produced uncountable twists and turns as they attempted to maneuver each other into a vulnerable position. Baalzebul pushed the button on the escalation of this Cold War, with simultaneous invasions of Dis by Zariel and Steiger by Moloch and Belial. In reaction, Mephistopheles led an attack on Maladomini, while Mammon relieved Dis. Eventually, the conflict came down to Maladomini, with forces from both factions, all 8 archdevils, facing off on the plains of scattered ruins. But a traitor was in the ranks. Gorion, Lord of Steiger, had been working for Asmodeus all along and had worked his agents into both sides of the conflict. At his signal, the blowing of his horn, the Asmodeus-loyal pit-fiend generals within the factions turned on their own forces, and all 7 of the remaining archdevils were overthrown. In the aftermath, Asmodeus had gathered even more power to himself, proving to the lesser archdevils that he was, truly, the master of hell. He reshaped the political landscape of the plain somewhat, returning Zariel, Despater, Mammon, Belial, Mephistopheles and Baalzebul to power within their own realms, but deposing Moloch and Gorion. Moloch was sent into exile on Avernus, while Gorion remained outcast within Steiger. For the loyal pit fiends, Asmodeus assembled the Dark Eight to command the efforts of the Hell in the Blood War. Bel, a pit fiend general, was set at Zariel's right hand and commanded legions within the Blood War. But he, as devils are wont to do, conspired to gain more, eventually imprisoning Zariel and usurping her place as Lord of Avernus. Bel is, at this point in our narrative, one of the most despised of the archdevils, and also one of the most ineffectual, for in return for supporting his efforts against Zariel, Asmodeus required of him to continue his efforts within the Blood War, distracting his ability to gain any further influence within Hell. Meanwhile, on Phlegethos, Belial decided to retreat somewhat from the politics and scheming of the archdevils, elevating, of course, with Asmodeus' permission, as now all things must, his daughter, Phaerana, to co-ruler status. Remember the Planes of Lore mystery of the she who was a fiery ruler of Phlegethos? Well, mystery solved. We touched earlier on the fate of Levistus, his trapped status, and his fall and return at the hands of Asmodeus, so let's move on to the fate of Moloch and his replacement, that being Malagard, a powerful hag, who some say was Moloch's lover, certainly a member of his court. Following the reckoning, Moloch was dethroned by Asmodeus and then kicked out of Malbolge by Malagard. The hag isn't a devil at all, and understands that her position as ruler of a layer of hell is tenuous. Baalzebul was transformed by Asmodeus into a slug-like being, but at least he retained rulership of Maladomini. Within the guide, we are reintroduced to some of the figures outlined in the Monster Manual 2, and in Dragon issues 75 and 76, these being Martinet, the constable of Asmodeus, and a fairly active individual in the lead-up to the Reckoning, and since, Glasia, daughter of Asmodeus, once consort to Mammon, during the Monster Manual 2 period, and now, in the Guide to Hell period, the leader of the Erinyes under Asmodeus. And the Dark Eight: Phurkas, Baalzephon, Zimmermar, Zapan, Zabos, Corin, Dagos, and Pieza. We are also introduced to a version of Asmodeus way beyond the leagues described in the Monster Manual and other first edition sources. Go and check the guide out. It paints a seriously scary view of him. The Fiendish Codex 2, Tyrants of the Nine Hells continues from the Guide to Hell into Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition. This book is one of the best resources for the Nine Hells in Dungeons & Dragons, building from the previous works and assembling a lot of useful tidbits into one place. There's a lot on packs, diabolic promotion, naming and so on, as well as a furtherance some details of the plane and the devils themselves. As for the furtherance of the history of Hell, we find Bel still in charge of Avernus, but perhaps more secure in that position than when we left him in the Guide. As with the Guide, and sort of from back in the 1st edition days, Amdusias and Malphas are still here as servants of Tiamat, which they have always been, regardless of whether Tiamat actually ruled the entirety of Avernus or not. The list of exiled devils now inhabiting Avernus has grown quite a lot, including many notables that were once dukes and holders of other positions within the courts of devils now deposed. Aemon, once duke under Gorion, Armarus, Azazel, Cahor, Dagon, Duskar, Cochabel, Melaria, Nisroch and Rumjal, all new to the lists, but may have had other names previously, as they are said to have been given new names to prevent them from being summoned. Bist the Hellcat, Nurgle and Caim the Outcast, that have been ever present thus far. Herodias, once magistrate of Gorion, and of course, unfortunate Moloch, once viceroy of Baalzebul and an archdevil. As for Zariel, the rumour hinted at this particular volume is that she is a prisoner of Bel, held beneath his bronze citadel. Despater still rules the second layer of Dis, and most of his court is intact, as is the case for Mammon and Minauros, although with Glazier elsewhere he has found a new consort in Gloire. Lady Phaerana is the official lord of the fourth hell, Phlegethos, reinforcing Belial's position as taking a back seat, as outlined in the guide. Interestingly, there is some setup here for strife between these two, as the various dukes and other unique devils seem to be factionalizing behind either Phaerana or Belial. The fifth hell, Stygia, remains under the control of Levistus, but we find out a few more details within the pages of the Fiendish Codex. Firstly, Asmodeus might not have been playing it straight when elevating Levistus to the Lord of the Fifth over Gorion, but more on that in a bit. Second, we find out what has happened to Gorion's court. Cosby, Gorson and Fecor were destroyed. We already know that Aemon and Herodias were exiled onto Avernus, and Dageres and Macalas are still in Stygia, serving Levistus. Malbolg is the most drastically changed layer in this iteration of Dungeons & Dragons Hell. Where once it was an infinite slope plagued by boulder falls and avalanches, it is now a place of sickly, stunted, sparse vegetation scattered over a pustulous, hungry wasteland. Literally hungry. Anyone that dies here could be consumed by the very ground itself. The layer's new form was created from the disgusting expansion and evisceration of the body of Malagard, the former hag ruler of the place. Now Glazier, daughter of Asmodeus and once consort to Mammon, rules here. The rumour has it that the invested power that makes an archdevil, when removed from Gorion upon his fall, was not given to Levistus, but instead to Glazier, thus leaving Levistus vulnerable in his imprisoned existence, which, given the history between Asmodeus and Levistus, makes a lot of sense. Glazier is served by Tartak, previous legate to Moloch, and, given Moloch's status as a subordinate to Baalzebul, once loyal to the Lord of Maladomini. Unlike most of the unique devils of Moloch's court, who returned to Baalzebul's side following the reckoning, Tartak has opted to serve Glazier, now the hag has been, somewhat horribly, forcibly, removed from power. Speaking of Baalzebul, he still rules in Maladomini, and his court has somewhat grown since we last encountered it prior to the guide. Those that served Moloch are now here, including Lilith, Moloch's old consort, who joins Baptis as part of Baalzebul's diabolical harem. Mephistopheles still rules in the 8th layer of Cana, his court largely intact, which means both of the primary schemers against Asmodeus are still here and still close at hand, relatively plainer speaking, to the Lord of Nessus. Of course, Nessus and its lord Asmodeus remain, as the eternal foundation lying in the very deepest pit of the hells themselves. And that brings us to 5th edition. There are 2 current primary sources here, the adventure Descent into Avernus and the DM's Guild publication Chains of Asmodeus. The former deals only with Zariel and Avernus, while the latter descends into the entirety of hell. There's not much to add here, as both follow generally the state of play Tyrants of the Nine Hells describes. A break from the prior narrative, though, exists with Zariel. Zariel is a fallen angel, this much hasn't changed, but her 5th edition background: she fought, as an angel, on Avernus, eventually being brought to Asmodeus in defeat, and then being given the layer of Avernus to rule by Asmodeus through the displacement of Bel. However, if we ignore Tiamat, the prior history has Bel displacing Zariel post-Reckoning. In the 5e works, we have Zariel displacing Bel, and then Bel potentially displacing Zariel at some point during play. So while everything else mirrors a post-Reckoning hell, we have some confusion here surrounding the governorship of Avernus. It's not unresolvable. We can have Bel and Zariel at each other's throats constantly, which, according to the source material, they are. Through this, we can assume some flip-flopping of rulership over the first layer. First, some unnamed forerunner of Bel, not inconsistent with planes of law. Second, Bel on his way up as a commander in the Blood War, governing Avernus from a strategic perspective, with whatever shadowy figure that sat in the background dissolving further into it, to play no further part. Third, along comes Zariel and her displacement of Bel. Fourth, the Reckoning, where Bel displaces Zariel and Zariel is imprisoned below the Bronze Citadel, after a bit. Now we have a gap to fill, and that's easily done by assuming that, at some point post-Reckoning and pre-descent into Avernus, Zariel redeemed herself in Asmodeus' eyes, or managed somehow else to free herself from Bel's prison. Either way, she becomes reinstated to ruling Avernus, and Asmodeus orders Bel to work with her. And thus, the duo as we see them in Descent into Avernus is explained. Chains of Asmodeus doesn't really offer much else here, other than to provide for either Bel or Zariel ruling the layer post-Descent into Avernus. Whatever the history of the Hells is, the goal of the Devils remains the same, although each of the Archdevils approaches that goal in different ways, and that is to achieve as much power as they can within the Machiavellian twists and turns of the political landscape of Hell, while at the same time supporting the collective Hells in the Blood War. Gaining power within the Hells often translates to the acquisition of souls, the plane's currency, for souls can be transformed into servitors and legions. Some souls will be acquired by default. Those folk who are lawful evil to the core will wind up in Hell. Other souls need to be more subtly brought into the fold, usually through corrupting mortals of other alignments to that of lawful evil, before they meet their end. The greater the fall for the mortal, the greater the achievement of corruption, and the more useful the soul. Of course, within Zariel and Triel, Baalzebul, we can see that not even angels are immune to the corruption of the Hells. Chains of Asmodeus and Tyrants of the Nine Hells lay out this corrupting activity most usefully, I feel, in ways that can be adapted to other editions of D&D, and even other games. Within Chains of Asmodeus, specific types of corruption and sin lead to specific layers of hell and the archdevils, which further informs the plots of these beings. If you have any interest in using devils in your Dungeons & Dragons games, I'd recommend checking those 2 books out at the least. In my opinion, no overview of the devils within Dungeons & Dragons would be complete without a comparison back to their origins within earthly mythology. Many of the beings described in the various Dungeons & Dragons sources have, I hesitate to say, real-world equivalents, and that is something that we will explore in the next part of this video essay. So until then, take care.